Well, hello and welcome to History Highlights presentation about Mark Twain and the Mississippi River. My name is Bill Wiemuth. Welcome. And over at historyhighlights.com, we have got fascinating true stories that you can enjoy in about an hour. And we've got them in a lot of different formats. You can enjoy them in a paperback book or a Kindle ebook or an audio book or video presentations like this. However you like to learn and explore fascinating stories, we like to make it available for you. And we have an array of different topics for you to choose from, mainly ranging from our early country's development westward. The Civil War, we're going to talk about Mark Twain today, the Steamboat Era, Alaska's development and exploration. You name it, we're developing new topics all the time. Come on over to historyhighlights.com and check it out. But today, you have come for one of my favorites, Mark Twain and the Mississippi River. Mark Twain would grow to be one of the most iconic Americans in history, one of our greatest writers. He traveled all over the world, kind of as an ambassador or a representative of the United States. He left a great library full of books and magazine articles for us to experience and to enjoy. And I'm glad to share him with you today. Mainly because as a historian, I really love Twain because he captured in one little paragraph, I think, the importance of presentations like History Highlights develops. He wrote this: "History requires a world of time and bitter hard work when you are merely stuffing yourself with a mixed up mess of empty names and random incidents and elusive dates which no one teaches you how to interpret, and which, uninterpreted, pay you not a farthing's value for your waste of time." As only Mark Twain could put it. So I'm going to try and give you that farthing's value. I'm going to try and share with you Twain's life and experiences, especially related to the Mississippi River, that chapter of his life. I get to do these talks quite a bit on riverboat cruises up and down the Mississippi River. And I'm always fascinated to learn that a lot of Americans have no idea that Mark Twain ever was a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River, and what an integral part of his life and career. So today we want to try and make sure you understand how that time on the rivers impacted his life, his career, and his writings. But I think most of you know that Mark Twain is a pen name. He was not born Mark Twain. And I think a lot of Americans seem to be aware that he grew up along the banks of the Mississippi River, a little town called Hannibal, Missouri, nicknamed America's hometown. But he was not born in Hannibal, and he was not born as Mark Twain. He was born as Samuel Langhorne Clemens, and he was born in a little cabin in Florida. I know, shocking, right? Florida, Missouri. It's about a half-hour drive from Hannibal, just a little way from the river. It was November the 30th of 1835, and as this young man, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, who will become Mark Twain, joins our world, we've got another strange visitor in 1835 as well, and that was Halley's Comet was making its journey across the heavens. And Twain forever would be fascinated with that comet because he said they came in together that fall of 1835. Now, when Sam was only about 3 years old, the family moved over to Hannibal, Missouri, right on the banks of the Mississippi River. And there his father was an attorney and a justice of the peace. Twain would live there in Hannibal until the age of 17, all of his formative years here. Sadly, his father passed away when he was only 11 years old, and quickly he had to drop out of school and go to work. Always amazes me, this literary genius had about a 5th grade education, everything else self-taught. Well, what does he learn to do? He goes to be an apprentice for the printer in town at age 13, and that would be his primary trade. As a matter of fact, this great photo of him, he's holding one of his typesetting racks, and he's put the capital letters S-A-M down there for Sam. Typesetting was such a drudgery, just put one letter at a time, putting it together, organizing it all backwards from right to left, so when it was inked and stamped it could be read. So this, of course, for a young boy, this dull, tedious work, leads to a lot of daydreaming, and apparently those daydreams usually focused around the Mississippi River. In his book Life on the Mississippi, he would later write this: "When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River, and that was to be a steamboat man. We had transient ambitions of other sorts, but these ambitions faded out, each in its turn. But the ambition to be a steamboat man, that always remained." His childhood dream, his lifelong dream apparently, was to get to work on a riverboat. Because when the riverboats came to town, everything changed. All of the action, all of the activity. Here's a passage, it's a couple of paragraphs long. I think it's worth it to set the stage of what this setting in this town meant to young Sam Clemens growing up on the banks of the Mississippi River. "After all these years, I can picture that old time to myself now. Just as it was then, the white town drowsing in the sunshine of a summer's morning. The streets empty, or pretty nearly so. The majestic, the magnificent Mississippi rolling its mile-wide tide along, shining in the sun. And then presently, a film of dark smoke appears, and instantly a drayman lifts up the cry, 'Steamboat a-comin'!' And the scene changes. The town drunkard stirs. The clerks wake up. A furious clatter of drays follows. Every house and store pours out a human contribution, and all in a twinkling, the dead town is alive and moving. Drays, carts, men, boys, all go hurrying from many quarters to a common center, the wharf. And assembled there, the people fasten their eyes upon the coming boat as upon a wonder they are seeing for the first time. Then such a scramble there is to get aboard and to get ashore and to take in freight and discharge freight all at one and the same time. 10 minutes later, the steamer is underway again. And after 10 more minutes, the town is dead again, and the town drunkard asleep by the skids once more." The action came to town when the riverboats arrived. This sleepy, dull little town of Hannibal, Missouri, population of maybe around 1,000 at the time Sam Clemens was growing up there. But boy, when the boat arrived, action, activity, and not only the action, but the people. So different than the show-me state, tried and true, staid Missourians. Down at the waterfront, there were colorful characters, these crazy rivermen. And Twain described them this way: "Hordes of rough and hardy men, rude, uneducated, brave, suffering terrific hardships with sailor-like stoicism. Heavy drinkers, coarse frolickers in moral styes, like the natches under the hill of that day. Heavy fighters, reckless fellows every one, elephantly jolly, foul-witted, profane, prodigal of their money, and bankrupt at the end of the trip. Fond of barbaric finery, prodigious braggarts, yet, in the main, honest, trustworthy, faithful to promises and duty, and often picturesquely magnanimous." Larger than life characters. And of course, that captures the imagination of this young boy growing up right there on the banks of the river. Now, much later in his life, Mark Twain would give an interview to the New York World. This was published on September 7th of 1902, late in his life. But he retold this story from his childhood. "Do you know what it means to be a boy on the banks of the Mississippi and to see the steamboats go up and down the river and never to have had a ride on one? Well, I was 7 years old, and my dream by night and my longing by day had never been realized. Until one day, when the big packet boat that used to stop at Hannibal rung up to the mooring at my native town, and a small chunk of a lad might have been seen kiting onto the deck, and in a jiffy disappearing from view. I was that small chunk of a lad. Well, the packet started along all right and gave me great thrills of joy to be on a real, sure enough steamboat. Until 17 miles below Hannibal, I was discovered by one of the crew. They put me ashore, and I was sent home by some friends of my father's, and my father met me upon my return. He just had to experience it. He had to get out on the water at age 7, stowing away to make that dream a reality. So by the time he is 17 years old and he's full of energy and dreams, he's had enough of sleepy little Hannibal, Missouri, and he's ready to make his way in the world. He would later write, "So by and by I ran away, and I said I never would come home again till I was a pilot and could come in glory. But somehow I could not manage it." He dreamed of being a steamboat pilot, but he just couldn't find a way to make it a reality, so he drifts from town to town and job to job. He makes his way far away as New York City, spends a little time in Philadelphia and Cincinnati, comes back to the Mississippi River Valley for a while, works for a newspaper his older brother Orion owns a little further up the river. He ends up back in Cincinnati in April of 1857. He's been working hard and saving his money. Now, what's he doing all this time to make a living? Mostly set and type. That was his primary skill. But he's a voracious reader, everything he can get his hands on. Plus, in his work as he's typesetting, he's reading new things every day in his job. And now at age 21, April of 1857, in Cincinnati, he develops a new plan. I love this little snapshot of this young man. We get a little picture of the crazy character that Mark Twain will eventually become. Here is his real plan. He has read that the great river of South America, the Mississippi of South America, so to speak, the Amazon River, has not yet been fully explored, and he is going to go and explore its upper regions. This was his real plan. He bought a ticket on a steamboat to carry him down the Ohio, down the Mississippi, all the way down to New Orleans, where he plans on buying a ticket on the next ship headed to South America. Lucky for us, the trip changed his mind. He wrote this: "I packed my valise and took passage on an ancient tub called the Paul Jones, headed for New Orleans. And when we presently got underway and went poking down the broad Ohio, I became a new being and the subject of my own admiration. I was a traveler, and a word had never tasted so good in my mouth before. I had an exultant sense of being bound for mysterious lands and distant climes, which I have never felt in so uplifting a degree since." Now, this part of the story may seem a little bizarre to you, but in those days you could explore all throughout a boat. There was hardly any restricted space, and Twain seemed to cover every bit of it. The steamboats in those days were magical in their grandeur and design. He described them this way: "The moment we were underway, I began to prowl about the great steamer and fill myself with joy. When you stepped aboard a big, fine steamboat, you entered a new and marvelous world, all garnished with white wooden filigree work of fanciful patterns, a far receding snow-white cabin, curving patterns of filigree work touched up with gilding, stretching overhead all down the converging vista, big chandeliers every little way. Each was an April shower of glittering glass drops, lovely rainbow light, falling everywhere from the colored glazing of the skylights. The whole a long-drawn, resplendent tunnel, a bewildering and soul-satisfying spectacle I had never felt so fine before." This was heaven to him. He loved every inch of the boat and seemed to explore all over. Now, another bizarre thing about those days is there was no Homeland Security Department yet. You could march right up the stairs on the outside edge of the boat and walk all the way to the top, all the way to the forward, and walk right into the pilot house. And there in the pilot house, customarily, there was a long bench down one wall that had a nickname. It was known as the Liar's Bench. Because as a guest in the pilot house, you had a bit of a social responsibility to make conversation, to tell a story, to tell a joke, to help pass the long hours of traveling up and down the river while you enjoyed watching the pilot do his work. Sam Clemens was parked on that bench most of the journey, apparently, and his love of the river and his fascination with piloting a steamboat began to grow all over again. And he began to think, maybe this is my chance at that childhood dream. Forget South America, too crazy, too big, too far away. Maybe I can make this into a reality. So on this journey downstream, he begins to make friends with a pilot by the name of Horace Bixby. Now, before I tell you about Sam and Horace and all of their adventures about to unfold, I want to make sure you know that Horace Bixby was a fascinating character. And at first, he was not really interested in taking on an apprentice, no matter how much Sam begged and begged for him to teach him how to be a pilot. Finally, Bixby says, all right, I'm going to take you under my wing and I'll teach you to be a riverboat pilot under two conditions. Number one, you're going to do everything I say anytime I say it. And Sam said, yes, sir, I agree. And number two was, Bixby demanded a payment of $500 tuition to learn the river. Boy, that was a lot of money back in those days. Now, by the way, throughout the course of this presentation, I've got these wonderful images I want to share with you over my shoulder here. And these are woodcut engravings that were done for early editions in the late 1800s of Mark Twain's books, illustrated editions. The images are all now in public domain, and I've got access to them online, and I just thought, boy, what a great way to kind of bring those wonderful images back to life. I will let you know, in the carvings, they picture Sam as almost as a boy during these trainings, but do keep in mind he's 21 years old as he embarks on all of this, so he is a young man despite the young pictures we'll see of him over my shoulder here. So finally he convinces Bixby to take him on as an apprentice, or what was known then and now as a cub, like a baby bear, a cub pilot, and young Sam began his training. He wrote this: I entered upon the small enterprise of learning 1,200 or 1,300 miles of the great Mississippi River with the easy confidence of my time of life. If I had really known what I was about to require of my faculties, I should not have had the courage to begin. I supposed that all a pilot had to do was keep his boat in the river. I did not consider that would be much of a trick, since the river was so wide. Old Bixby tells Sam, my boy, you must get a little memorandum book, and every time I tell you a thing, put it down right away. There's only one way to be a pilot, and that is to get this entire river down by heart. You have to know it, just like A, B, C. Young Sam Clemens writes, that was a dismal revelation to me, for my memory was never loaded with anything but blank cartridges. Well, I certainly can understand that. And right off the bat, Mark Twain, Sam Clemens, gives us this wonderful account of what it takes to be a riverboat pilot. Two things seemed pretty apparent to me, he wrote. One was that in order to be a pilot, a man had got to learn more than any one man ought to be allowed to know. And the other was, he must learn it all over again in a different way every 24 hours. Because the Mississippi River rises and falls dramatically with every rainfall and from season to season. From spring to autumn, it can vary 40 feet elevation change in any given year, submerging different sandbars, even entire islands, and the current constantly flowing in different ways and different directions. But Sam begins to study, and his love of the river starts all over again. He would later write such beautiful accounts of this time of history and such beautiful accounts of the river itself. Here's one of my favorites, simply about viewing a sunset on the Mississippi River. I still keep in mind a certain wonderful sunset which I witnessed when steamboating was new to me. A broad expanse of the river was turned to blood. In the middle distance, the red hue brightened into gold, through which a solitary log came floating, black and conspicuous. In one place, a long slanting mark lay sparkling upon the water. In another, the surface was broken by boiling, tumbling rings that were as many tinted as an opal. Where the ruddy flush was faintest was a smooth spot that was covered with graceful circles and radiating lines ever so delicately traced. The shore on our left was densely wooded, and the somber shadow that fell from this forest was broken in one place by a long, ruffled trail that shone like silver. And high above the forest wall, a clean-stemmed dead tree waved a single leafy bough that glowed like a flame in the unobstructed splendor that was flowing from the sun. There were graceful curves, reflected images, woody heights, soft distances, and over the whole scene, far and near, the dissolving lights drifted steadily, enriching it every passing moment with new marvels of coloring. I stood like one bewitched. I drank it in a speechless rapture. The world was new to me, and I had never seen anything like this at home. Horace Bixby gets a job offer that in a way is going to change Sam Clemens' life. Horace Bixby got a job offer to go work on the Missouri River, which, by the way, tells us he was an excellent pilot. Even in modern day, only the best of the best navigate the Missouri River. It is swift current. It has meandering bends that turn on a hairpin. It has sandbars scattered throughout it from the silt and sediment carried by that river, and they pick up and move with the current every few hours or few days. It's a constant puzzle to be solved over and over again. So Bixby says, I can't resist the money. I'm going to go take this job, but Sam, I'm not taking you with me. I'm going to leave you here on the Mississippi to go New Orleans to St. Louis, New Orleans to St. Louis, back and forth, and memorize that 1,200 miles of river. Yeah, over and over and over. So I'm going to subcontract you to another pilot. Bixby leaves. And the new pilot that Sam is apprenticed to is a man by the name of William Brown. Here's how Sam described Brown. He was a middle-aged, long, slim, bony, smooth-shaven, horse-faced, ignorant, stingy, malicious, snarling, fault-hunting, moat-magnifying tyrant. I early got in the habit of coming on watch with dread in my heart. The tensions between these two began to grow and grow, so much so that Sam writes, I often wanted to kill Brown, but this would not answer. A cub had to take everything his boss gave in the way of vigorous comment and criticism. However, I could imagine myself killing Brown. There's no law against that. And that was the thing I used to do the moment I was abed. Instead of going over the river in my mind, as was my duty, I threw business aside for pleasure, and I killed Brown. Oh, I killed Brown every night for months, and not in old, stale, commonplace ways, in new and picturesque ones. The tensions between these two continue to grow. Now, during this time period, Sam has a younger brother back in Hannibal, Missouri. His name is Henry Clemens, Sam's younger brother. And Henry writes to Sam, oh my gosh, working on the boat, that's so cool. Get me a job, I'll do anything. And so when a position comes available, Sam puts in a good word, and young Henry is hired to come and work on board this steamboat called the Pennsylvania. Now, on one fateful day, headed downstream towards New Orleans, the old captain of the boat, his name was Captain Kleinfelter, great captain name. Captain Kleinfelter asked Henry to run an errand up to the pilot house and to tell Brown that down around the next bend there was a landing where they needed to stop and they were supposed to pick up some cargo. So Henry makes the journey up to the pilot house, and as he comes in, he steps up behind Brown, steering there at the big wheel, and he gives Brown the message. Now, as was the norm, Brown did not even acknowledge young Henry. That's the way it always was with Brown. He was arrogant and rude and would rarely speak to anyone below the rank of pilot, and we're going to learn he's just about deaf as a post, and maybe that's why he never answered anybody. Well, Henry gives him the message, doesn't think much about it, waves at his brother Sam sitting over on a wooden stool, taking his notes, keeping track of things along the river, and off he starts to go. Well, the boat went down around that bend and sailed right on past the landing. And Sam would later write, oh, how he had wished that he had said something, but he was afraid of Brown's temper and just sat there watching and trying to figure out what was going on. Well, the old captain, of course, gets involved in this, comes storming up. What are you doing? Turn around, go back, wasting time, wasting fuel. Why didn't you stop? Brown says, what do you mean stop? Well, I sent Henry to tell you. Well, the boy never came. And the captain asks Sam if Henry ever came. And Sam's not going to lie to the captain. He tells him. And Brown just trembles with fury. His face turns red. Well, the boat turns around. They go back. They load up the cargo. They get moving again. And sure enough, a little while later, Henry was sent on another errand up to the pilot house. Now, as he comes into the pilot house, Sam knew that Brown had just been boiling over this, and he was worried about what might unfold. And sure enough, as he comes in, Brown starts to curse at him and yell at him, how dare you make me look the fool with the captain? Henry protested his innocence and starts to get ready to leave, and Brown snapped. Now, in the old pilot houses in those days, it could be a little chilly up there, so there was often a little potbelly stove to keep the pilots warm. Sam recorded that Brown leaned down, picked up a 10-pound chunk of coal, and started trying to take a swing at Henry with it. If he'd have hit him with that 10-pound chunk of coal, it probably would have killed him. But Sam ends up between those two with his wooden stool ready to stop things, and he clobbers him. And now he realizes, not only have I hit the pilot that I am apprenticed to, as Brown's lying on the floor of the pilot house, he realizes I'm probably going to prison. So I might as well get my money's worth out of it. And he jumps on Brown, and all those frustrations just come pouring out, and he starts beating the tar out of him. Now remember, the boat is going down the river. Twain would later say at least the boat had the sense to stay to the middle. But Brown yells and screams, kicks him off of him, jumps back to the wheel to save the boat, and the two brothers, Henry and Sam, run for it. Now, of course, the old captain is going to get involved in this. And I love the scene that takes place. He brings young Sam Clemens into his office, and Captain Kleinfelder kind of interrogates him. You know, is this true? Did this really happen? Sam's not going to lie. Yes, sir. I hit him with a stool. I knocked him down. And he says, I understand you then pounded him considerable? And he says, I'm not going to lie. Yes, sir, I did. I pounded him. And he says, well, now, tell you what. I want you to never strike a pilot on duty. You got to learn to lay for him ashore. That's the wisdom of age, for sure. So the upshot of this whole scene is that Brown refuses to work on board with Sam. He wants him put off the boat when they get down to New Orleans. And the captain tells Sam, to tell you the truth, I'd rather keep you than Brown. I'm sick of him too. Pardon me. But I don't have time to get another pilot. I've got cargo loaded up waiting for me in New Orleans. So I'm going to have to put you off the boat. But hang on, here's what I recommend. We're going to dock right next to another boat, another captain friend of mine. And that boat is called the A.T. Lacey. And I know they're waiting on a delivery of cargo that they also are going to take clear back to St. Louis. So I'm going to ask that captain if I could put you over on his boat, and then you could follow behind us. And when you catch up, I'll telegraph ahead. I'll get a new pilot. When you catch up to St. Louis, we'll bring you back aboard. And I'll iron all of this out with Bixby, if that sounds okay with you. And young Sam said, oh my goodness, thank you, Captain. Yes, that sounds great. So they get down to New Orleans, and those two brothers are sitting up on the levee, smoking cigars, laughing about how all of this is unfolded. Henry and Sam, and the next day they say goodbye. And the steamboat Pennsylvania, with mean old Brown and brother Henry and Captain Kleinfelder, loads up its cargo and leaves New Orleans and begins traveling back up towards St. Louis. Sam moves over to the other boat, the A.T. Lacey, but they wait 2 days for their cargo to finally get delivered and get underway. Traveling upstream, they move along the Mississippi River. This is now June of 1858. And when Sam's boat the A.T. Lacey arrives at a place called Greenville, Mississippi, he gets the terrible news that the steamboat Pennsylvania had exploded just below Memphis with an estimated 150 lives lost. He has no idea what's happened to his brother. He travels a full extra day. Another day, they finally get all the way on up towards Memphis, near where the accident had taken place, and the Beale Street landing had been turned into a makeshift hospital and morgue. And Sam begins to prowl through the dead and the wounded, trying to find his brother. And he does finally find his brother. Young Henry is wounded terribly and is still unconscious. Finds a few other crew members, and Sam will learn that during the accident, during the explosion, Henry, some passengers, some other crew members had actually been blasted off of the boat, caught some debris in the water, pieces of the exploded boat, and had floated to shore. But seeing the boat burning, hearing the screams for help from their fellow crew members and from their passengers, young Henry Clemens had a skill that quite honestly was pretty rare in the middle part of the 1800s. But having grown up on the banks of the Mississippi River, he was a good swimmer. And he dove into the Mississippi, he swam back out to the burning wreck to try and help others, and he subsequently would be burned terribly over his entire body. Sam Clemens sat at the bedside of his unconscious brother for the next few days and finally realized he needed to let the family back in Hannibal know what had happened. Oh, how to write that letter. It seemed as if he almost couldn't even write it to a direct relative, so to speak. He wrote it to his older brother Orion's wife. This is Molly Clemens, Sam's sister-in-law. They'd become good friends, and they would write quite frequently throughout the course of their lives, and Molly kept that letter for the rest of her life. And when I came across it in the archives there at the Mark Twain Museum in Hannibal, Missouri, I thought it was one of the most powerful things I had ever read. He wrote this: "Lost and ruined sinner as I am, even I have humbled myself to the ground and prayed as never a man prayed before, that the great God might let this cup pass from me, that he would strike me to the earth, but spare my brother, that he would pour out the fullness of his just wrath upon my wicked head, but have mercy, mercy, mercy upon that unoffending boy. The horrors of 3 days have swept over me. They have blasted my youth and left me an old man before my time. Molly, there are gray hairs in my head tonight. For 48 hours I labored at the bedside of my burned and bruised brother, and then the star of my hope went out and left me in the gloom of despair. Then poor wretched me, that was once so proud, was humbled to the very dust, lower than the dust. For the vilest beggar in the streets of St. Louis could never conceive of a humiliation like mine. Men take me by the hand and congratulate me and call me lucky because I was not on the Pennsylvania when she blew up. May God forgive them, for they know not what they say." Henry Clemens died on June 21st of 1858. He was one of more than 100 that would perish in that accident. And from all indications, just about until the day he died, Sam Clemens blamed himself. His own pride, his own temper. If he hadn't gotten in that fight with Brown, maybe he could have been there. Maybe he could have saved his brother. He very likely would have been killed in that explosion as well. Well, when life treats you that way, what else can you do? I'm sure most of us have had tragedy come to our families, and I think all you can do sometimes is to try and put one foot in front of the other and stumble ahead through the fog of grief. Sam Clemens does the same. He travels on that steamboat Pennsylvania from New Orleans all the way up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, that 1,200 miles, and then turned around and came back and did it over and over and over again. He was an apprentice on the Mississippi River for 17 months of studying and training and working off the $500. He was 24 years old in April of 1859 when he sat for his examination and earned his pilot's license. A lifelong dream to work on the Mississippi River. Later in a book he wrote called Eruption, he wrote this one. A pilot in those days was the only unfettered and entirely independent human being that lived on the earth. Piloting on the Mississippi River was not work to me, it was play, delightful play, vigorous play, adventurous play, and I loved it. He would later write a letter to a friend named Will Bowen in August of 1866, and I love this description. All men, kings, and serfs alike are slaves to other men and to circumstance, save alone the pilot, who comes at no man's beck and call, obeys no man's orders, and scorns all men's suggestions. The king would do this thing and would do that, but a cramped treasury overmasters him in one case and a seditious people in another. The senator must hobnob with Canal whom he despises, and banker, priest, and statesman trim their actions by the breeze of the world's will and the world's opinion. It is a strange study, a singular phenomenon, if you please, that the only real, independent, and genuine gentlemen in the world go quietly up and down the Mississippi River, asking no homage of anyone, seeking no popularity, no notoriety, and not caring a damn whether school keeps or not. To be a pilot on the Mississippi River. Twain loved piloting. He seemed to savor every moment of it, from the mechanical to the strategic, to the weather, to the current, and especially the sheer beauty and mystery of the river. This is one of my favorite passages from Life on the Mississippi. The face of the water in time became a wonderful book. A book that was a dead language to the uneducated passenger, but which told its mind to me without reserve, delivering its most cherished secrets as clearly as if it uttered them with a voice. Throughout the long 1,200 miles, there was never a page that was void of interest. Never one that you could leave unread without loss. Never one you would want to skip, thinking you could find higher enjoyment in some other thing. There never was so wonderful a book written by man. Never one whose interest was so absorbing, so unflagging, so sparklingly renewed with every reperusal. And it was not a book to be read once and thrown aside. For the river has a new story to tell every day. Sam went on with his work very successfully. He wrote, "In due course I got my license. I was a pilot now, full-fledged. I dropped into casual employments, no misfortunes resulting. Intermittent work gave place to steady and protracted engagements. Time drifted smoothly and prosperously on. And I supposed and hoped that I was going to follow the river for the rest of my days and die at the wheel when my mission was ended. But by and by, the war came. Commerce was suspended. My occupation was gone." After 4 years working on the Mississippi, about 2 as an apprentice, about 2 more as a pilot, the Civil War turned the Mississippi River into a battlefield. Sam goes back to Hannibal, Missouri. His older brother, Orion Clemens, influenced his life time and time again. Now, Orion has been involved in helping get Lincoln elected. And so the Lincoln administration asks him, would you be willing to take a stagecoach and ride out across the continent out to help us set up a new territorial legislature for this new territory of Nevada? And Orion agrees. And Sam says, is there an extra seat on that stagecoach? Because I could sure use a change of pace. He's grieving as he watches his nation plunge into war, brother against brother. He's lost the career that he loved so dearly. He's lost his brother in that tragic steamboat accident. He later writes, "I had to seek another livelihood, so I became a silver miner in Nevada. Next, a newspaper reporter. Next, a gold miner in California. Next, a reporter in San Francisco. Next, a special correspondent in the Sandwich Islands. Next, a roving correspondent in Europe and the East. Next, an instructional torchbearer on the lecture platform. And finally, I became a scribbler of books." Don't you just love that? A scribbler of books. The only way he seemed to perceive himself. By the way, it's while he's in Nevada and he begins his writing career, he's writing for the Territorial Enterprise, this newspaper that seemed to have it seemed to be like the modern day tall tales that we would see at the grocery counter with all of the tabloids. And they wanted to distract their readers from the hardships of life in the West and from the tragic national news of the Civil War. So Twain is writing these crazy, crazy tall tales, and I mean crazy tall tales. Everything you see at the grocery counter, from alien landings to two-headed babies, he's writing those kind of stories, and he doesn't want to put his real name on these tall tales. So he's going to go through, over the course of his career, a series of different pen names before he finally lands on one that he likes. By the way, since he's just joking, he's just joshing around when he writes these, for a while he used the pen name Josh. No last name, because he's just joshing. Little too clever, little too creative maybe. He needs something a little more elaborate, but still with a little tongue in cheek. So for a while he wrote under the pen name Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass. I'm glad I don't have to be a great fan of Snodgrass. But it was February of 1863 that for the first time he signed one of his articles with the pen name Mark Twain. And that is going to stick around for a while. For the rest of his life, you see, every time he writes that name, every time someone calls him by that name, every time he's introduced by that name at an event or at a speech, it would remind him of the thing that he loved the most: steering a steamboat up and down the Mississippi River. Because you see, Mark Twain is a riverboat term. Let's do it. In the old days, they didn't have fancy technology to tell them the depth of the river out in front of them. There was a crew member, one of the deckhands, who was known as the leadsman. And he had a long piece of line, long piece of rope, and he would tie onto that a big chunk of lead down at the bottom. And every 6 feet, he would put a lashing or a mark or tie a knot in that rope. They measured things in fathoms in those days. A fathom is 6 feet. So every 6 feet, the rope has got a knot in it. And he would cast that out in front of the boat. It would sink down into the river, and down to the bottom it would go. And as it came by the edge of the boat, he would grab that, pull it up, reel it back onto the deck, and in those fractions of fathoms, he would turn and shout that up to the pilot house. "Captain, it's 1/4 Getting a little deeper. "Captain, it's 1/2 It's getting even deeper. "Captain, quarter less Twain." And finally it's getting even a little deeper, and he would shout, "Mark Twain." What the heck am I talking about? You know this. You may have just forgotten you know it. Let's do it. "East is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." It's an old-fashioned term for two twain, and the deckhand, the leadsman, was literally shouting that you could mark or note that it was two twain, Mark Twain, that you could note that it was 2 fathoms deep. And here's why that was important. The old boats at that time in history sank down into the river about 6 feet. About 1 fathom down was the average depth of a boat. So if you had 2 fathoms, you had a whole extra fathom, 6 extra feet of water underneath your hull, it meant you weren't going to hit anything. Mark Twain was the call that indicated safe running, and a pilot loved to hear that echo through the Mississippi River air. Mark Twain sticks around, and boy, does he hold on to it. He loved the river, and he carried so much of it with him. He later wrote, "I served under many pilots and had experience of many kinds of steamboatmen. I am to this day profiting somewhat by that experience. For in that brief, sharp schooling, I got personally and familiarly acquainted with about all the different types of human nature that are to be found in fiction, biography, or history. When I find a well-drawn character in fiction or biography, I generally take a warm personal interest in him, for the reason that I have known him before, met him on the river." All great characters reminded him of someone he had known working on the Mississippi River. And for me, having lectured on the river for about 2 decades now, I would have to agree. Colorful, wonderful folks that we've traveled with up and down those rivers. Twain would take these memories, these cherished childhood dreams, he would blend it all together into several of his books. The first of which was a book in 1876 that was published called Adventures of Tom Sawyer. It was a pretty good hit, kind of put him on the map. He would follow that up 9 years later, in 1885, with perhaps his all-time classic, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I want to give you a great quote that kind of puts Twain's legacy and the importance of Huckleberry Finn in context. I want to read you the quote, but I'm not going to show you who said it until afterwards. Here's the quote. "All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn." That's a pretty dramatic claim. To me, even more dramatic, that it was written by Ernest Hemingway. Mr. Twain was held in pretty high regard. He would go on to write almost 30 different books, some 28 different volumes that he would create, thousands of newspaper and magazine articles, and would solidify himself as one of the great pillars in the literary legacy of the United States of America. Twain comes back to the river many times, most notably in 1882 as he prepared to write a series of magazine articles for The Atlantic, which would later be adapted into the book version that we would call Life on the Mississippi. Twain loved those journeys up and down the river, refreshing his memory of those old steamboat days. 1882 seemed like old steamboat days to him. But finally in 1883, that was all edited together and published in book form called Life on the Mississippi. Many of the passages I'm sharing with you today from that book, it's another great read, full of just beautiful descriptions and some fascinating history, and another one that I highly recommend. I wanted to focus mainly on Twain's life on the river. And now I want to give a little more personal information about his life later and try and tie in for you how the river in a way was kind of always with him, always a part of him in his life and his career and his writings. He did have a family life. He met a gentleman on a trip to Holy Land. Charles Langdon was his name, and he would later meet Charles Langdon's sister. He said he had seen her picture and almost fallen in love with her immediately. Her name was Olivia Langdon. They were eventually married, and she became Olivia Clemens. They were joined at the hip. He absolutely adored her. She was not only his partner and bride, but also an important part of his creative process. Apparently, every day whenever he finished, she would read, oftentimes aloud, and give notes and comments and editing. He later wrote this about her. "I never wrote a serious word until after I married Mrs. Clemens. She is solely responsible. To her should go the credit for any influence my subsequent work should exert. After my marriage, she edited everything I wrote." They would go on to have 4 children together. He would build her and the family a beautiful home in Hartford, Connecticut that still stands as a wonderful visitor site if you ever get a chance. And as you see a couple of slides here of the old home, what always hit me, and especially when I visited, was how much that staircase reminded me of a grand staircase going up the center of an old steamboat, and how the filigree work reminded me of a steamboat. And then this shot from this angle of the house, I suddenly was just taking my breath away, as that front porch stretching out to the left sure looks like the bow of a boat, with a cabin of a steamboat up above, even almost a pilot house up there on the corner. The chimneys sort of look like big smokestacks. All that thing needs is a paddle wheel at the back, and that is a home certainly influenced by steamboating, that's for sure. The family would spend most of each summer, sometimes 3-4 months at a time, in upstate New York at Olivia's sister's home in Elmira, a place called Quarry Farm. And there they built for him a little writing cabin, an octagonal-shaped building with a little fireplace and wonderful windows where he could go and sit out there and smoke his cigars and play with his cats and write and write and write. It sits on a bluff overlooking the Chemung River Valley. Beautiful 12-foot octagonal house, kind of mimicked a pilot house again, same kind of feel. It was in that cabin that he would write Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and Life on the Mississippi, The Prince and the Pauper, and so many of his all-time classics unfolded right there in that room. And I love that later about that place, he wrote this: "Once or twice each night, we'd see a steamboat slipping along in the dark. And every now and again she'd belch a whole world of sparks up out of her chimney, and they would rain down in the river and look awful pretty." So with a view of a river, with a view of steamboats going by, he continued to create his masterpieces. Mark Twain had a hard life. Even though he made a fortune, he had really severe financial problems. He had a trend of investing most of his wealth in every type of new technology that absolutely would not work. And he lost everything by late in life. And these bad bank investments, his publishing company's woes, he was facing bankruptcy. And so by July of 1895, with some help of some friends, they put together a worldwide lecture tour for him to be able to go and make enough money to help settle some of his debts. They departed in July of 1895. His wife Olivia, he called her Livy, and their daughter Clara traveled with him for much of that journey. After 23 performances in 22 American and Canadian cities, he was feeling pretty good. And from Vancouver, British Columbia, in August of 1895, he wrote a letter to the San Francisco Examiner. "Lecturing is gymnastics, chest expander, medicine, mind healer, blues destroyer, all in one. I am twice as well as I was when I started out. I have gained 9 pounds in 28 days and expect to weigh 600 before January. I haven't had a blue day in all the 28. My wife and daughter are accumulating health and strength and flesh nearly as fast as I am. When we reach home 2 years hence, we think we can exhibit as freaks." He would spend 8 weeks touring through Australia, 6 weeks around New Zealand, 8 weeks across India, 7 weeks across South Africa. By the end of his tour, he and his family sailed from Cape Town on the 15th of July, 1896, after more than 100 performances. He was exhausted, but much closer to solvency. Up to Europe they went. He continued on his speaking tour, and I love that in all of this traveling, he found some wisdom to share with all of us. He wrote this: "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired while vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime." In addition to financial problems, Twain had terrible personal loss. They were in England the latter part of the tour. It was late summer, and they received a telegram that their daughter Susie was sick but would recover. So Olivia and Clara, his wife and daughter, departed, sailing across back to check on her, while Sam finished his obligations. Tragically, he received a telegram just a couple of weeks later that his daughter, Susie, at age 24, here in 1896, had passed away of spinal meningitis. About Susie's death, he wrote, "It is one of the mysteries of our nature that a man, all unprepared, can be struck by a thunderstroke like that and live." His son, Langdon, had died as an infant. He would eventually bury 3 of his 4 children. No parent should ever bury a child. His father had died young. He had lost 4 of his 6 siblings by a pretty young age. And Olivia, sadly, had been sickly most of her life. And in the early 1900s, due to her ailments, they moved to Italy for better climate, see if perhaps she could recover. But at age 58 in 1904, she passed away there in Florence. They finally made the journey all the way back to upstate New York, where her memorial service was held in the same family parlor where he had married her years before. Less than 2 weeks after Olivia's memorial service, Twain wrote a letter to Olivia's sister. Yes, she did love me, and nothing that I did, no hurt that I inflicted upon her, no tears that I caused those dear eyes to shed could break it down or even chill it. It always rose again. It always burned again, as warm and bright as ever. Nothing could wreck it. Nothing could extinguish it. Never a day passed that she did not say with emphasis and enthusiasm, "I love you so. I just worship you." They were always undeserved. I know something, and I get some poor, small comfort out of it, that what little good was in me, I gave to her to the utmost, full measure, the last grain and the last ounce. And poor as it was my very best, and far beyond anything I could have given to any other person that lived. I think Twain captured how he felt about his marriage in a scene in a book of his called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Here's how he described marriage. People talk about beautiful friendships between 2 persons of the same sex. What is the best of that sort as compared with the friendship of a man and wife, where the best impulses and highest ideals of both are the same? There is no place for comparison between the 2 friendships. The one is earthly, the other is divine. He lost his daughter Jean on Christmas Eve of 1909 when she had an epileptic seizure and drowned in the bathtub. Twain had heartache and loss and tragedy, it seems, at every turn. This great humorist had so much suffering. Mark Twain turned 70 years old in 1905, and they gave a lavish affair for him at a restaurant called Delmonico's in New York City. And he got up and gave a speech that night, and there were many journalists in the room taking shorthand, recording this. We get great record of Twain's speech that night, and the subject of the speech was what it takes to make it to 70. And since I know we all hope one day to achieve that milestone, I thought I would share with you some of his words. I will offer here as a sound maxim this: we can't reach old age by another man's road. I have been regular about going to bed and getting up, and that is one of the main things. I made it a rule to go to bed when there wasn't anybody left to sit up with, and I made it a rule to get up only when I had to. In the matter of diet, which is another of the main things, I have been persistently strict in sticking to the things which did not agree with me until one or the other of us got the best of it. I have made it a rule never to smoke more than 1 cigar at a time. I have no other restriction as regards smoking. If you're not aware, Twain loved his cigars. He was known to go through sometimes a box of 50 a day, leaving stubs around everywhere, and it was one of the first products he let use his name as a licensing tool. He went on, "As for drinking, I have no rule about that. When others drink, I like to help. I've never taken any exercise except sleeping and resting, and I never intend to take any. Exercise is loathsome. It cannot be of any benefit when you are tired, and I was always tired. We can't reach old age by another man's road. My habits protect my life, but they would assassinate you." Well, it was December of 1906 when an iconic image of Twain that we all still picture him in took place. The United States Congress was holding hearings to revise laws about copyright, something that was very important to Twain, especially later in his life, wanting to leave a legacy for his one remaining daughter. And so in December of 1906, he came to Congress to testify. On that cold winter day, he arrived in Congress in a long black overcoat. And then in dramatic fashion, as he took his seat to begin testifying, he threw off the overcoat to reveal he was dressed in an all-white suit. The newspaper photographers took snapshots, he gave interviews, it gathered a lot of attention for the copyright discussion. And in the New York Times on December 8 of 1906, he gave this interview. "I have found that when a man reaches the advanced age of 71 years as I have, the continual sight of dark clothing is likely to have a depressing effect upon him. Light-colored clothing is more pleasing to the eye and enlivens the spirit. Now, of course, I cannot compel everyone to wear such clothing just for my especial benefit, so I do the next best thing and wear it myself. A group of men in evening clothes looks like a flock of crows and is just about as inspiring." Mark Twain's famous white suit was only a trademark item in the last few years of his life, and yet such an iconic image that we still picture him in that suit today. I think Mark Twain wrote to me one of his most fascinating passages in 1909. Listen to this. "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together. They must go out together. Oh, I am looking forward to that." Remember, by this point, Twain has had such heartache and such loss. Halley's Comet did return the following year in 1910. It reached perihelion, its closest point to the sun, on April the 20th. And on April the 21st, Mark Twain died at his Stormfield estate in Redding, Connecticut. He was buried in Elmira, in the family plot there together. Predicted his death almost a year in advance. Mark Twain was one of the most famous Americans. He was recognizable to everyone, from his speaking, from his writing. He seemed to attract a crowd everywhere he went. He traveled all around the globe. Mark Twain was a good friend of Thomas Edison. He even recorded at Edison's New York laboratory, however the wax cylinders were destroyed in a fire in 1914. But Thomas Edison once said, "An average American loves his family, and if he has any love left over for some other person, he generally selects Mark Twain." Mark Twain remains one of the most iconic Americans. I love that just a few years ago they issued a stamp in Mark Twain's honor, and I love that it not only says Mark Twain, USA and Forever, which to me kind of sums it up, but I love that the river is behind him and there's a river boat in the background, because it was always what he cherished, what he dreamed about, what he loved. I think perhaps it's also very fitting that he is the namesake of a 1955 riverboat that the most Americans have ridden on. And that, of course, is the Mark Twain riverboat at Disneyland. That makes a short little loop, but boy, everybody loves it and has enjoyed it. Mark Twain loved the river. It was constantly in his heart, his spirit, and in his writings. He wrote, "If I have seemed to love my subject, it is no surprising thing. For I loved the profession far better than any I have followed since, and I took a measureless pride in it." Mark Twain and the Mississippi River. Hope you've enjoyed learning a little more about that chapter of his life. You can, of course, read more and follow up with our ebooks, paperback books, and audiobooks. I want to say thanks to all of the organizations and entities that have lent me images to use in the PowerPoint and helped me with research along the way. I'm so blessed to be assisted by so many who are so passionate about the great stories and characters from history. We are over at historyhighlights.com, where you can find all kinds of fascinating true stories you can read or listen to or watch in about an hour. We do have an array of podcasts and YouTube videos and blog posts. I know you'll enjoy every moment of it. We look forward to seeing you over at historyhighlights.com. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful day.